Hello, welcome. My name is Leah Matthew. I will be introducing the book English Linguistic Imperialism from Below, published by Multilingual Matters. So the key questions that the book addresses are: how do we approach intensive mothering when it is taken up by non-elites in the global south, particularly in India? And because English sits at the heart of these intensive mothering practices, what happens to English when it is folded into non-elite intensive mothering practices? So low-fee private schooling is typically explained through the concept of school choice. When it comes to the Indian context, the school choice framework assumes that there is a rational consumer who's choosing between public and private schooling. And this invisibilizes a lot of the ethical moral questions that mothers are struggling with and working out through their intensive mothering practices. The second theoretical framework with relation to English, translingual practice, but the context is misaligned, right? Because translingual practice becomes powerful when it is held up against monolingualism as a hegemony. But when bilingualism and biliteracy are the hegemonic paradigms, as it is in India, translingual practice loses some of that political purchase that it has. The book takes up a different set of theoretical and conceptual questions, and it looks at the conditions of possibility. So the book draws on anthropological work on consumption, on anthropological scholarship on liberalization in India, which is the market reforms. I draw on literature on morality and ethics, anthropology of ethics, on ordinary ethics, on affective labor, gender, and transition literature. And what these allow me to really look at is how is consumption used by young women from marginalized class and caste locations in the South Indian state of Kerala to become ethical, moral persons. Through their participation in the market, they attempt to become good mothers. The specific location is the southern Indian state of Kerala, what is now called Kerala. So this map is from the colonial period when there are princely states of Travancore and Cochin. The book traces histories of the fieldwork village and its surroundings from 1894. English schooling has a very long history in the region. The school where I conducted fieldwork was established as a slave school in 1894. So I tell the story of slave schooling, of middle class schooling, of English schooling in the region and how they sort of intersect and interact in many ways to produce the aspirations that we're seeing today. So aspirations are not new. There have always been aspirations for English schooling as well. What is different about the context of market reform is how consumption works into aspirations, and that's what the book describes. In terms of methods, the book is based on a 19-month ethnography. It's a comparative ethnography of an English medium private school and a neighboring state-funded Malayalam medium school, and of both mothering and the provision of schooling. One of the key arguments of the book is that the inhabitants of the village had migrated temporally. They were still living in the same village, but the village had changed so much, it was as if they had migrated. And the changes that happen in the village happen through market reforms. Wages increase close to 900%, and what they're able to consume also changes very dramatically. And this has gendered angles as well, whether it is cooking practices, what did kitchens look like earlier and what do they look like now? What kinds of utensils, what kinds of materials, what kinds of embodiments are possible in kitchens? So if earlier the clothes that you wore always told everybody else what caste you belonged to. With market reforms, um, the clothing market changes, and wearing a salwar kameez does not tell anybody what caste you belong to. So these kinds of dramatic changes are what I call temporal migrations, where an entire generation of citizens have moved into new material social worlds. If you have experienced radical social mobility, you want your children to experience a similar kind of mobility and dignity. And that is where English aspirations came in. That the way to move forward and to continue with the experience of social mobility was to invest in English medium schooling. But these very intense aspirations evoke middle class anxieties. And that is what I describe with the term aspiration shaming. Now, coming to the specific experience of mothers at the Malayalam medium school. So, here we have a very small number of Dalit women, Dalits are former untouchable caste. They are the ones who are remnant at state funded schools and at Malayalam medium schools. But this does not mean that they are not aspirational. In fact, they are obsessively aspirational precisely because there is no other way to move out of poverty. Everybody else has moved into new social material locations, but they are left out. And the hope to move into those same locations are now concentrated in education and on their children. And this leads to sometimes very painful experiences for both mothers and children as they're struggling in resource deprived circumstances to study. And this leads to very painful experiences of shame because the deprivations in provision does not change. In fact, it intensifies. And this is what I described through the reforms. There are multiple reforms that I analyze in the book. There are very different actors, different theoretical frameworks. But what ultimately all of them do is that they reform English to mean something else. So, in the Indian context, English always meant, or knowing English always meant that you knew how to read and write English. This history is now invisible. Now, the commonsensical notion is that you are accepted as somebody who knows English if you can socialize in English, if you can speak English. But this kind of resource, the English speaking person, and the kinds of materials that go with that English speaking person are not available in non elite schools, in either the English medium, the low paying private English medium, or the Malayalam medium school, which means that all the resources that were earlier available have now been taken away. Literacy practices at the Malayalam medium school, English literacy practices, were disallowed by the state. And instead, they were asked to learn with the assumption that there would be some English speaking person who was not physically there, who could not physically be there, and who would never be there. On the one hand, they redefined English from literacy learning to conversational skills. And on the other hand, in very practical terms, they exacerbated resource deprivation. So, in terms of teacher practice in the classroom, there's classroom ethnography, there is analysis of textbooks, analysis of policy, as well as teacher training. What the reform set out to do was humanize education, saying that children are being burdened with rote memorization and we should liberate them so that they can enjoy childhood. But what it actually does is, one, it takes away all the resources that were already there, and second, it replaces it with an equally regimented new skill, conversational skills. Typically, we imagine that English leads to social mobility. But the book argues that instead it was radical experiences, gendered experiences of social mobility that prompted very intense desires for English medium schooling. And non-elite aspirations evoked intense middle class anxieties, which manifested in various ways, including the shaming of aspirations and the valorization of oracy, of conversational skills, over literacy practices. So, this is an overview of the book. I will be in conversation with Professor Leslie Bartlett and Professor Amanda Gilbertson on the 14th. Do join us.